some years leading up to the events of the Tryweryn scheme, a number of different valleys had come under consideration, and it was here at Dolanog where the battle lines were first drawn. In many ways, Dolanog was a grim foreshadowing to many of the same events that would befall Capel Celyn.
Mae gwaed yr haf i'n brwydro a cael I fod ar y gwyllt ers talwm wedi olchi gan y glaw. Ni chlywaf gan y daran yn I welaf gan y myllt. Nid oes ond crian o baith ar bob llaw. Ymhe mae owain yn awr. Ymhe mae owain yn awr.
In the spring of 1955, the villagers of Dolanog awoke to find a group of men with strange equipment on the fields and hills which flank the tiny village. It was soon discovered that they were from Liverpool University, and the equipment was for surveying. According to an interview in the Western Mail, several farmers confronted these surveyors and were told that the men were carrying out a geological study. However, the true intentions of this individual and the consulting engineers with him were never fully explained. Liverpool Corporation were adamant that the proper authority was given by farmers and owners of land to conduct surveys. However, there seems to be some discrepancy in the reported information and that of those who worked in the fields.
They came on the sly. They told one farmer they were making a geological survey for Liverpool University. They may have belonged to the university, but they did not say they were working for the corporation.
Were the farmers given proper explanations of what exactly they were looking for? With similar reports of underhanded tactics being used during the Celyn scheme, the narrative surely sides with those farmers.
Clog cyntaf sgynna I amdano fo oedd yr peiriannau mawr fan troi fyny I dyllu bob un cae yn y cwm, a dyn o pawb eisiau gwybod pam wrth yn siŵr. A'r ateb oedden nhw'n gael y rheswm am hynny oedd bod nhw eisiau edrych pa fwynau oedd yn y tir, bod nhw'n gwneud fel rhyw syrfe gael gwybod pa fwynau oedd o fewn y tir de. Ond fel datblygodd I ddiwedd arach, prif reswm y cynllun hwnnw oedd darganfod bod yna ddigon o adnoddau o fewn y cwm I adeiladu'r argae de.
Once the men were gone, the rumours and reports began to surface, and a clear picture began to form as to what exactly Liverpool were looking for. A suitable location to build a new reservoir to meet the ever-growing needs of the city's population. Unlike the scheme that would come to end the fate of Celyn, however, at first the news of a modern reservoir was welcomed by some in Dolanog. With no concrete plans in place, there were those who had no problem with the rumours that it would be on farming land and not on Dolanog itself. As more information came to the surface, fears grew that it wasn't just fields that were under threat. Newspaper reports at the time ranged from small areas to the whole parish being a potential target. Some said that the village could be completely submerged in a few short years. The rumour mill was well and truly turning, and the anxiety caused began to change the mood. Just a few short weeks after the proposal surfaced, a committee was formed in the town to try and protect as much as they could. A tiny village standing up to a larger influence seemed like a monumental task. They did, however, have one ace up their sleeve. One which may have had a greater influence than any petition, protest, or sabotage. Dolanog was the home of hymn writer Anne Griffiths. Her poems and hymns had, by the turn of the 19th century, cemented her as an important figure of Welsh history. As a result, a memorial chapel was built in her honour in the centre of Dolanog. To this day, the area is still a place of pilgrimage to thousands who wish to trace the steps of this Welsh icon. One of the rumoured plans was to not only drown the village, but her home of Dolwar Fawr, just outside of the town. This desecration of what many considered a deeply spiritual site is arguably the initial factor in turning those vaguely supportive of the scheme into opponents. An official opposition to the drowning committee was formed by the Reverend Tryweryn Davies. By September of that year, negativity surrounding the scheme was well known, as villagers had gone from interested to opposing in just a few short weeks. Support for the campaign came from all across Wales. For example, the Council of the National Eisteddfod in September of that year passed a motion to support the village's campaign. Even from outside of Wales, holiday makers and those who came to visit the area sent letters into papers and to the corporation in support of the village. This show of solidarity piqued the interest of then President of Plaid Cymru, Gwynfor Evans. Despite lacking mass political representation, support from a party would become of significant importance. On September the 24th, 1955, some 4,000 members attended a Plaid Cymru rally at Llanuwchllyn near Bala. In a rousing speech by Gwynfor Evans, he told the crowd that any and all attempts to take Welsh land would be vehemently opposed. Liverpool Corporation's response to the growing tide of opposition was relatively toothless. It stated that there were no concrete plans at this time and that other options were to be considered. And all this attention on the town wasn't always welcome by those fighting in the campaign. The Reverend considered the opposition a cultural and religious matter, not something that required political steering.
There is nothing political about our position. We've never brought politics into it. We want to keep it out. We think that the introduction of politics only harms our cause.
Did the interference of politicians help or hinder the scheme? And would lessons be learned going forward for the party? In many ways, the decade post-Dolanog would serve as an awakening for Plaid Cymru. By the end of October 1955, the reports of the scheme being dropped began to surface. It seemed that Dolanog, despite the initial reports, was not quite suitable, and as a result, an alternative area had been chosen. Dolanog was not the only location that had been considered. There had been brief, however significant, discussions around drowning the entire area around Bala, including the town itself. Whether those discussions went further than whispers, we will never truly know. However, it could be argued this demonstrates the profit-driven callousness of Liverpool Corporation's decision-making at the time. by December 1955, the Dolanog scheme was finally dropped. As usual, there are two conflicting viewpoints on this decision. As previously mentioned, Liverpool Corporation had stated that no concrete decision had been made to drown the valley. However, it was under serious consideration. Gwynfor Evans, on the other hand, called this statement a piece of bluff, and that they never had any intention to drown the valley. An engineer's report was made public in 1956, a year after the scheme was dropped, which stated that the scheme would not yield the amount of water required for Liverpool's needs. To this day, many still believe that the initial announcement of the Dolanog scheme was a tactic to draw fire and support away from the site they originally wanted. You have to ask the question of why they wanted to do something such as this. Why would Liverpool Corporation announce such a scheme before quickly dropping it for another, much more lucrative plan? The answer for Liverpool is quite simply economics. The cost and yield of water for the Dolanog scheme was not enough. However, could it be that they used Dolanog to soften up opposition, to narrow down its options to the plan it had always intended on implementing? Where the Dolanog opposition had been met with no real comment from Liverpool, the opposition to Tryweryn had been met with much anger from the city officials. One thing is for certain. Dolanog acted as a stage rehearsal for the events that would transpire in the coming months and years. There was every chance that cries of "Cofiwch Dolanog" would echo throughout Wales in the decades that would follow. One can only imagine how a country's culture that has become linked with the loss of a village would have been shaped if it was Dolanog and not Celyn that had been drowned. Today, Dolanog is like many of the small villages that dot the landscape of rural Wales. Stereotypically sleepy, a hotspot for camping holidays and those seeking to find their countryside getaway. Would Celyn have become as sleepy if it was given that second chance at life? The tragedy of these events remains unknown. The unknown of what initially set Dolanog in Liverpool's sights, the unknown of why it was dropped, and the unknown of what Wales would have been like if it was here and not Celyn. With a secondary site chosen and announced in the papers, to some, this would have been a sight of elation. Dolanog would no longer face the looming shadow of a watery grave. However, for one village, the news would come as a death sentence.
Camir yn cerbydau, tagu yn y mŵr, clywed sgrech peiriannau, gweled dwr na gŵr. Miloedd o wynebau, yn wag I gyd heb air na gwen yn gwasanaethu'r meistri, yn ifanc ac yn hen. Y llanc fi'n llawn gobeithio, edrychwch arno naw. O 9 I 5 bob diwrnod, yn gaeth i'r peiriant mawr. Ar meddwl o ffwym ar breichiau, oedd am newid cwrs y byd.